So we all like to use scales to some degree when we're improvising, but a major scale played on its own doesn't sound much like jazz. A lot of us play patterns, so we play things like thirds, intervals of a third, so we go 1, 3, 2, 4, 3, 5, 4, 6. Those kind of ideas are really common. I see a lot of people practicing those things, and those are good exercises to work on, makes the scale sound a bit more musical. But it still doesn't quite sound like jazz. I think the key to getting it to sound like jazz is to bring in some chromatic notes. Now, chromatic notes means what I would call outside notes. There's 7 notes in that major scale, but there's 12 notes in the chromatic scale, in the octave. So the 5 notes that are not included in that scale, those are your outside notes. If we can start to incorporate some of those, then we can start to bring in some of this jazz vocabulary, some of this jazz language. So here's a simple way that we can adapt that last exercise to add a chromatic approach note. So we're going to play that same pattern, the pattern in thirds. So we're going to go C, E, D, F, E, G. So it's a pattern of 2, basically. You're going 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. We're going to turn it into a pattern of 3 by adding a chromatic approach note before the first note. So our first note is C. So before we play the C, we're going to play B. So instead of going C, E, we're going B, C, E. And instead of going D, F, we're going to go C sharp, D, F, D sharp, E, G, and we can carry on up the scale like that. Now it makes a pattern of 3, which is an odd note grouping. Now I've done some videos on odd number note grouping, so it's worth checking those out if you haven't seen those already. And so that's a way of starting to introduce some of these outside notes into that scale. It still sounds like a C major scale, but it's got that chromatic element in it as well, which starts to bring it more towards the arena of jazz. But how do you use that to make jazz lines? Well, let's think about what other variations could we do of that. We could go from a chromatic note above, so we could go, instead of going, we could go, so that would be one variation. Or we could change the order in which we play the third. So instead of playing C to E, going from low to high, we could go from high to low. And then we could put chromatic notes before the higher note. So we could go or, okay? So there's a lot of different variations that you can do there. Now, what I'll do is I'm going to play the exercise going up exactly the way we just played it. So just going from a semitone below the first of the notes. But then on the descending version of the scale, I'm going to start to mix it up a bit. I'm going to start to change the order that I'm playing the third. So sometimes going up a third, sometimes coming down a third. And I'm going to change the chromatic note from being maybe below or sometimes above. And you'll start to see that as I bring in those variations, it starts to move more into the realm of starting to sound like I'm improvising a jazz line rather than just playing an exercise. Let's have a listen.